He grabbed her wrist, the way men like him always did, like she was something he'd already paid for. Gerald Whitmore, 62 years old, 300 pounds of old money and bourbon confidence, pressed Mara into the gray service corridor with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The noise from the gala was muffled behind the door. Nobody was coming. He'd made sure of that. "You misunderstood me earlier," he said, and tightened his grip. Mara's tray of champagne flutes hit the floor. Crystals scattered across the concrete like broken teeth. She didn't scream. She'd worked enough late-night ear shifts to know that screaming only worked if someone was listening. So she did the only thing left. She grabbed the sleeve of the man, standing at the far end of the corridor. She didn't know his name. She didn't care. She just needed a witness, a body. Anything between her and Gerald Whitmore's certainty that he was untouchable. The man she grabbed turned slowly. Dark eyes, jaw like carved stone, suit that cost more than her monthly rent. He looked at her hand on his sleeve, then at Whitmore, and something shifted in his expression, not anger exactly. Something quieter, more permanent. If you're asking yourself what you would have done in that corridor, I need you to stay with me. Because what happened next changed everything. Before we go further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. Every week I bring you stories that will keep you up at night. Drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it's already pulling at you, hit that like button. Now let's go back to that corridor. Mara Vey had been on her feet for 11 hours by the time Gerald Whitmore cornered her. She'd picked up the catering shift because her hospital paycheck had a gap in it. 3 days she'd taken off after losing a patient she shouldn't have lost. 41-year-old father of two who'd come in with what looked like a panic attack and left in a body bag because the attending had moved too fast, and Mara had been the only one in the room who'd noticed the irregularity in his rhythm too late to change anything. She'd filed the incident report. She'd done everything right. And then she'd gone home and sat in her kitchen for 3 days eating cereal and watching the pigeons on her fire escape because she didn't know what else to do with grief that had nowhere to go. So she took the catering shift. Silver trays, stiff uniform, champagne flutes she couldn't afford to break. The Westfield Grand Charity Gala for Pediatric Cancer Research. 500 guests at $1,200 a plate. The kind of event where men like Gerald Whitmore moved through the crowd like they owned the oxygen. He'd found her near the East Bar around 9:30. He'd said something she didn't hear over the string quartet. She'd smiled politely and moved away. He'd followed. By the time she realized what was happening, really happening, not just a drunk rich man being mildly annoying, she was already in the service corridor, and the door had swung shut behind them, and Gerald Whitmore's hand was on her wrist in a way that was not a question. "You've been ignoring me all night," he said. Like that explained something. "Sir, I need to get back to the floor." She kept her voice flat. Professional. Trained. Don't escalate. Don't antagonize. Redirect. Talk. He smiled. "Is that so difficult?" The grip tightened. Her tray tilted. And in the half-second before the glasses hit the floor, Mara made the kind of decision you make when the options have narrowed to almost nothing. She grabbed the man at the end of the corridor. She didn't choose him. He was simply there, standing near the fire door, with a phone to his ear, back to the wall, watching the gala through a rectangular window in the door, like he was deciding whether to go back in or not. He was tall. He was solid. He looked like someone nobody would want to argue with. That was the entire calculation. The moment her fingers closed on his sleeve, he ended the call. He didn't look startled. He didn't look annoyed. He looked at her with the kind of attention that made her feel simultaneously safer and less safe. And then he looked at Gerald Whitmore, and then he put his phone in his jacket pocket with a slow, deliberate movement that somehow communicated everything that needed to be communicated. "There's a problem out here," he said. His voice was quiet. That was the thing she'd remember later. He didn't raise it. He didn't need to. Gerald Whitmore blinked. He recognized something in the man's face, something that bypassed the drunk confidence and hit a more animal register. His grip loosened on Mara's wrist. He smoothed his jacket front. "Just a misunderstanding," Whitmore said. "Good." The man held the door open. "The bar's that way." Whitmore left. He didn't say anything else. He walked back into the gala like a man remembering an appointment, and Mara stood in the corridor with crystal debris around her feet and her heartbeat doing something complicated in her chest. Picked up the tray. Her hands were steady. She'd always been good at steady. "You okay?" the man said. "Yes." She crouched down and started gathering the unbroken stems. Old instinct assessed the damage. Triage what's salvageable. Move. "Thank you. He do that often?" "I don't know him." She stood. "I assume men like that do things like that often." Something moved across his expression. Not quite a smile. "Yeah, they do." He reached into his jacket and produced a matte black card. No logo. No name. Just a phone number in small, clean type. He held it out. She looked at it. "What's this for?" "In case he doesn't take no for an answer later." She took the card, mostly because he was still holding it out, and it seemed rude not to. "I doubt he'll bother. Men like that want easy, maybe." He pushed off the wall. "Don't go back out there alone." He went back through the door into the gala, and the sound swallowed him the string quartet, the murmur of 500 people with money and nowhere particular to be. The door swung shut. Mara stood in the corridor for another 10 seconds. She put the card in her apron pocket. She picked up the tray. She went back to work. She didn't ask anyone who he was. She assumed it was over. She found out his name the next morning. Not from a newspaper, not from a news alert, from a photograph that came through on her phone via a number she didn't recognize, forwarded from a number she'd never seen, with no message attached. Just the image. It had been taken in the service corridor. She was visible from the side, her uniform, her hand on his sleeve, her face partially turned toward the camera. He was in full profile, sharp and unmistakable. Beneath the image, in a caption she couldn't fully parse, because the surrounding text was in some kind of cipher, was a name. Dante Vescari. She Googled it while standing in her kitchen in her pajamas, with cold coffee going tepid in her other hand. The results came back fast and told her nothing useful and everything alarming. 47 articles. 6 years of financial reporting that somehow never specified exactly what business he was in. Profile from a real estate publication that referred to him as a significant investor in tri-state commercial property. One photograph from a charity event in 2019 where he stood next to the mayor and looked like he was doing the mayor a favor. And beneath the polished surface layer of Google results, if you knew where to look, and Mara did not. But the person who'd sent her the photograph clearly did, was a different story. Connections to the Vescari family, which operated out of Red Hook, and controlled a logistics network that the NYPD and the FBI had been trying to map for a decade. Suspected infrastructure in 3 states. A name that moved through certain circles, the way weather moved through a valley. Everyone felt it. Nobody pointed at it. She put her phone down. She picked it up again. She typed, "Who are you, and why did you send me this?" The reply came in 11 seconds. "Ask yourself why you're already in the photograph." She blocked the number. She went to her hospital shift. She told herself it was nothing some strange prank, some internet gawker who'd been at the event and gotten lucky with a camera, some nobody playing at drama. She told herself this through 4 hours of triage and 2 back-to-back trauma cases and a code she helped run in day 3. And she told herself this well enough that by the time her shift ended at 7 p.m., she'd almost convinced herself. Then she walked out of the hospital and Dante Vescari was standing beside a black SUV at the curb. No guards visible. One driver, engine running. He was in a different suit from the night before Navy, no tie, and he was looking at her with the same quality of attention she'd noticed in the corridor. Like he'd assessed the situation before she'd even cleared the door. Ms. Vey. He said her name like he'd already known it, which, she understood in that moment, he had. She stopped on the sidewalk 6 feet from him. "You ran my name. I ran everyone in that corridor. Matter of fact. Including Whitmore. And you worked trauma at Mercy General. Single. No family in the city. 2 years at your current apartment." He wasn't trying to be threatening. That was almost worse, the information delivered with the same affect someone might use to read a grocery list. "You should know you're in a photograph that's circulating on a network I monitor." "I know, someone sent it to me." That surprised him. She saw it a brief recalibration behind his eyes. "Who?" "I don't know. I blocked the number." She crossed her arms. The evening traffic was loud around them. "What kind of network?" He studied her for a moment. The kind where being identified as important to me is not a safe thing to be. The sidewalk felt like it had shifted slightly beneath her feet, kept her expression neutral. 11 years of emergency nursing trained you to process alarming information without visibly unraveling. I'm not important to you. I grabbed your sleeve for 30 seconds. The photograph doesn't know that. He reached into his jacket and produced his phone, turned it toward her. The image was clearer on his screen, high resolution, professionally composed in a way that made the grab look deliberate, intimate even. Her hand on his arm, both of them caught in three-quarter profile. The man who took this works for a competitor of mine. His name is Rafael Davero. He's been trying to identify the people closest to me for the past 8 months. Mara looked at the photograph, then at Dante, and he thinks I'm one of them. He thinks you're significant, which makes you a target. He said it simply. No drama, no apology. I'm telling you this because you deserve to know, and because I'm the reason you're in this situation. You didn't take the photograph. I should have cleared that corridor before I used it. Something tightened briefly in his jaw. That's on me. She almost said something deflecting. Old habit: diminish, minimize, move on. Instead, she said, what does significant mean exactly? In terms of what Davero might do. He held her gaze. It means he might try to use you to get to me. The traffic moved. A cab laid on its horn a block away. Mara stood on the sidewalk and processed that the way she processed information in the ER rapidly, without the luxury of emotional response, just what are the facts? What are the options? What does the situation require? What are you offering? She said. He blinked. She'd caught him off guard again. What? You came here to tell me I'm in danger because of something that happened in a corridor I didn't choose to be in. So you came here for a reason beyond notification. She watched his face. What are you offering? A pause. He put his phone back in his pocket. Protection. My estate in Westchester. Controlled environment. Full security. 2 weeks. Maybe less. Long enough for me to resolve the situation with Davero. And in exchange, another pause. This one longer. I need Davero to believe the photograph is accurate. That you matter to me. If he thinks I'm protecting something valuable, he'll move on it. I can use that. She understood in a single cold beat. She was bait. He wasn't trying to hide it. That was something, she supposed. You're very honest about this, she said. I find it more efficient. And if I say no? He looked at her steadily. Then I do what I can to quietly remove you from Davero's attention. No guarantees. And you go back to your apartment and hope he decides you weren't worth the effort. Mara looked at the SUV. She looked at the hospital entrance behind her. She thought about her apartment, which was small and had a deadbolt that a determined adult could defeat. In under 40 seconds, she knew, because she'd watched the super demonstrate the locking mechanism when she moved in, and all she'd been able to think was, that's not enough. She thought about the 41-year-old father of 2 she hadn't saved, and how much of life came down to the moment, right before a decision. The last second, you still had all your options. 2 weeks, she said. I keep my phone. I keep access to my hospital contacts. There's an emergency at the hospital, a genuine one, I go. Your people don't stop me. He nodded once. Agreed. And I sleep in a separate wing. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. The East Wing has its own entrance. Then we have a deal. She walked toward the SUV. I need to stop at my apartment first. I'm not going anywhere without my own clothes. He opened the door for her. Not like a performance, just like someone who decided to open a door. She got in. The driver didn't turn around. The tinted glass closed out the city. Mara sat in the back of Dante Vescari's car and kept her hands loose in her lap and told herself the same thing she told herself. Before every difficult shift, you've handled worse. Pay attention. Don't let the machinery overwhelm the medicine. Whatever this was, she would navigate it the same way she navigated everything, one decision at a time. The Westchester estate was not what she'd expected, which was foolish because she hadn't really known what to expect. Something aggressively expensive, she supposed. Something designed to demonstrate power. What she found was a house that looked like someone had once actually lived in it, flagstone paths, worn in the middle. A kitchen with a spice rack that had been used enough to go dusty on the less common selections. A library with books that had been pulled off shelves and not always replaced in order. Whoever had decorated it had been trying for warmth and had mostly gotten there. The east wing had its own bathroom and sitting room and a window that looked out over a garden going slightly wild at the edges from a few weeks of neglect. She set her bag down. She washed her face. She sat on the edge of the bed and called the charge nurse at Mercy General and told her she was dealing with a family situation, non-emergency, and would be out for up to two weeks. "You have the time," the charge nurse said. Her name was Philippa, and she'd worked trauma for 23 years, and she dealt in facts, which was why Mara trusted her. "Take care of yourself." "I will." She ended the call and sat with the phone in her hand and listened to the estate. It was quiet in a way her apartment, never no traffic, no pipes, no upstairs neighbor with unpredictable footsteps. Just the garden sounds coming through the window, and the distant low murmur of the security team she'd noticed stationed at the perimeter. Someone knocked on the door. 2 knocks, deliberate. She opened it. Dante. He'd changed into something less formal, dark pants, shirt with the collar open. He was holding a glass of water. "I thought you might want this," he said. "It's a long drive." She took the glass. "It's a 35-minute drive. From your side of the city longer." He didn't try to come in. He leaned against the door frame with his hands in his pockets and looked at her like he was doing what she'd done in the SUV, making a rapid assessment without allowing the machinery to show. "You have questions. You've been holding some since the hospital." "I have many questions." "Ask them." She looked at him in the doorframe, the scar along his jaw she hadn't noticed the night before. The careful way he held his shoulders like someone who'd learned that controlling the body was the first step in controlling the room. The insider. The one feeding information to Devereaux. "You said he's been at this 8 months." "Yes." "You don't know who it is yet." "No." "That bothers you more than Devereaux does." He was quiet for a moment.
Yes.
"Because Devereaux is outside. The insider is inside." "Yes." He said it, like she'd translated something correctly. "You're perceptive. I work trauma. Perceptive is a survival skill." She drank some of the water. "The photograph, you said someone in Devereaux's network took it. But how did I get it first? Before you even told me." That quality of recalibration again. He was quiet long enough that she knew it was a real question, one he'd been working on. "I don't know yet. Either someone on Devereaux's side had a reason to warn you, which means they knew you weren't actually connected to me, or someone on my side sent it. The insider. Possibly. Testing how you'd respond." He looked at her. "You should sleep," he said. "Tomorrow's going to require you to be visible. Lunch in Manhattan. I'll explain the parameters in the morning." He pushed off the door frame. He was almost to the end of the hallway when she said, "Why did you stay in the corridor last night?" "Before I grabbed you, you were standing there for a while before Whitmore came in." "Stopped. Didn't turn. I needed air." She waited. He turned enough to look back at her, over his shoulder. "There are rooms where I'm required to perform a version of myself I'm tired of. Sometimes I step out to remember what I actually think." A pause. "That's more than I intended to tell you." He walked away. Mara stood in the doorway of her borrowed room and held her water glass and thought about a man who needed to escape a party to remember what he actually thought, and how that was possibly the most human thing anyone had said to her in months. She didn't sleep well. She hadn't expected to. But somewhere around 3 in the morning, listening to the garden and the perimeter quiet, she started to think that 2 weeks was both a very short time and a very long time, depending on what happened inside them. She thought about the photograph, her hand on his sleeve, how it had looked deliberate in the image, how, from a certain angle, she supposed it had been. The garden was still dark when Mara heard the first argument. She wasn't trying to eavesdrop. She'd been awake since 5, sitting in the window seat of the east wing with her knees pulled up and her coffee going cold, watching the grounds crew do their first sweep of the perimeter. 2 men, earpieces, the unhurried movement of people who'd done the same route enough times to stop thinking about it. The estate was quieter than her apartment, but not silent. It breathed differently. The walls were thick enough to muffle words but not tone, and the tone coming from somewhere down the main corridor was not a conversation. Dante. And someone else, a man whose voice she didn't recognize. Pitched lower, tightly controlled in the way that meant the control was costing him something. She couldn't hear words. She heard the rhythm of it, short, clipped exchanges. A pause. Then Dante's voice, quieter than the other man's, which somehow made it worse. When Dante went quiet, she'd already noticed. He was not retreating. He was compressing. The argument ended without resolution. She could tell by the sound of it the way it stopped, rather than finished. A door closed. Footsteps receded. She drank her cold coffee and filed the information away. 7:30, a woman named Celia knocked and told her breakfast was in the main dining room when she was ready. Celia was somewhere in her 50s, efficient, neutral-faced, and communicated in the economy of someone had long ago decided that fewer words meant fewer problems. She left before Mara could ask questions. Dante was already at the table when Mara came down. He was reading something on his phone, and he put it away when she walked in, which she noted. Across the table from him sat a man she hadn't seen before, early 40s, broad-shouldered, with the kind of posture that came from military training or a sustained effort to look like it. He had a jaw that was currently doing a great deal of work, staying still. Victor Hale, Dante said. My logistics director. He oversees movement and operations across the tri-state network. Victor looked at Mara the way someone looks at a variable they haven't finished calculating. Ms. Victor. She sat down, she poured coffee. She kept her movements unhurried, in the way she kept them unhurried when a family was watching with work on someone they loved because panic was contagious, and calm was the only thing that ever actually helped. You were arguing with Dante this morning. Victor's jaw tightened. He looked at Dante. Dante looked at Mara with something that might have been the first genuinely unguarded expression she'd seen from him. Somewhere between startled and faintly entertained. You heard that? I heard the shape of it, not the content. She put her coffee down. I'm going to be here 2 weeks. I'd rather know what the shape of things actually is than have people manage what I hear. Victor said, she's been here 14 hours. She's also right, Dante said. Simple. Final. Victor looked at the table. The jaw kept working. I don't think bringing a civilian into the state while we still have an open security problem is a sound operational decision. Noted, Dante said. I'm noting it again, also noted. The silence between them had history in it, the particular density of men who have worked closely enough together that disagreement sounds like something tearing rather than something new. Mara ate her toast and watched it. The lunch today, she said. Walk me through what you need from me. Dante turned to her. Table tension didn't evaporate, but it reorganized. Carmine's in Midtown. Private room in the back. I have a standing reservation. I've used it for years. The right people know I take meetings there, including Devero's network. Will be visible from the street for 30 seconds entering and exiting. That's enough. You want to be seen with me. I want Devero's people to see you choosing to be with me. Willingly. Comfortably. He watched her. Can you do that? I'm a trauma nurse. I perform calm for a living. She finished her coffee. What do I need to know about the cover? How long have we supposedly known each other? Victor made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Mara looked at him. You have something to add? This is a mistake, Victor said. Not to Dante. To her. Direct which she appreciated, even if the content was hostile. You don't know what you're walking into. You think 2 weeks in a comfortable estate and a lunch in Midtown, and then it's over, and you go back to your apartment. That's not how Davaro operates. How does he operate? She said. Victor looked at Dante. Dante's expression said, answer her. He's patient, Victor said after a moment. He doesn't move until he understands every piece on the board. He'll watch you. Study your patterns. The lunch today isn't the exposure, it's the beginning of the exposure. He'll want to know who you are, where you came from, whether you're real. And if he decides I'm not real, Victor didn't answer. Dante said quietly, then you become less useful as leverage and more useful as a message. The toast in her stomach settled like ballast. She kept her face level. Then we'd better make it convincing. The drive to Manhattan was 40 minutes with traffic. Dante sat beside her in the back of the SUV and reviewed something on a tablet, and she looked out the window and thought about what Victor had said. He'll want to know who you are. She understood professionally how true that was. In the ER, the most dangerous situations were the ones where someone had made up their mind about what they were seeing before they'd looked carefully enough. It cut both ways you could use it if you were steady enough to hold the frame. Tell me something about you that Devero could verify, she said. Dante looked up from the tablet. What? If his people are watching the lunch, they'll try to assess whether our dynamic is real. Real couples, real people who matter to each other, have specific knowledge. Details. She turned from the window. Tell me something verifiable. Something I could reference that would read as intimate. He studied her for a moment. She had the feeling he was deciding not what to say, but how much. I have a place in Red Hook, he said. A building I own that I've never put in my name. I go there when I need to think without anyone knowing where I am. The 4th floor has a view of the water. I've spent more nights there than I have in Westchester over the past year. Why? Because the estate has too many people in it who need things from me. She filed that. What do you eat? He blinked. What? People who are close to you know what you eat. It's the kind of thing that comes up in conversation. It sounds small, and that's exactly why it works. I eat whatever's in front of me. I don't care much about food. A pause. Care about coffee. I have it the same way every time, no sugar, a small amount of cream, not milk. I'm particular about it in a way I'm not particular about most things. She noticed he said this with a faint current of self-awareness, like he recognized the smallness of the detail and found it mildly embarrassing. Thought, that's the most human thing about you, and you almost hit it. Okay, she said, my turn. I'm a night person. I read on my phone before I sleep, usually news, which is a terrible habit. I have a fear of escalators that I've managed down to a mild discomfort, but it's still there. I'm close with exactly 2 people outside of work. A woman named Diane, who I went to nursing school with and who now lives in Portland, and my building super, who is 74 and makes too much a rose con polo for one person and periodically leaves containers outside my door. His name is Hector. Dante was looking at her. You didn't need to tell me all of that. You need to know it if we're doing this right. A pause. The city started to thicken around them as they crossed the bridge. The escalator thing, he said. How'd it start? I fell on one when I was 7. Nothing serious. Scraped my knee. But my knee got caught at the top plate, and I couldn't move for about 30 seconds while people filed around me, and nobody stopped. I remember thinking, I'm invisible. She looked out the window. That's not the kind of thing you forget. He was quiet. Then I had a mentor who died in front of me when I was 22. Car accident. Nothing cinematic, wet road, wrong speed. He was the first person who'd ever taken the time to tell me the difference between what I was and what I could be. A pause that had something raw in it. The night it happened, I sat in a parking garage for 4 hours because I didn't know where else to go. I didn't feel invisible. I felt like the wrong person had died. The SUV was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry, Mara said. It was 12 years ago. That's not how grief works. He looked at her. Something in the careful architecture of his expression had shifted, slightly, in a way she suspected he hadn't intended. He turned back to his tablet, but he didn't read it. The restaurant was old Italian, in the way that only ever meant one thing, in Manhattan red leather, low-light menus that had changed twice in 40 years and didn't tend to change again. The maitre d' knew Dante's name before he reached the podium. The walk to the private room in the back took them through the main dining room, and Mara kept her pace easy and her chin level, and put her hand briefly on Dante's arm when they passed a table of men in suits who were watching, with the particular quality of attention that meant they were paid to watch. She felt Dante's arm tighten fractionally under her hand. He was aware of the same table. In the private room, once the door was closed, the man in the gray suit by the window, she said quietly, I saw him. He was photographing us. Subtle phone at ear height, angled down. He did it twice. Dante looked at her with something that was approaching respect. You're good at that. Emergency nursing. You learn to track a room without looking like you're tracking it. She sat down. That's Davero's network? An edge of it. He sat across from her. His phone was on the table face down, and she noticed he hadn't touched it since they'd walked in. This is the part where we have an ordinary lunch. While being photographed. Yes. What do ordinary people talk about at lunch? Corner of his mouth moved. Not quite. I don't have a lot of data on that. Neither do I. Most of my lunches are eaten standing over a sink. She looked at the menu. Tell me about the Red Hook building. You said you go there to think. What do you think about? The question clearly landed somewhere he hadn't expected. Picked up his own menu. Decisions I've already made. Whether I'd make them differently. Would you? Some of them. He set the menu down without reading it. There are things in this work that accumulate. Actions you take because the situation requires them. And at the time they feel necessary. They are necessary, but they stay with you differently than you expected. Regret. Accounting, he said. I don't have the luxury of regret. I just keep track. She looked at him over the top of her menu. That sounds lonely. He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was level but careful. I don't think about it that way. What way? As a condition. It's just a feature of the work. He glanced at her. You must deal with the same thing. In the ER. Things you carry. Yes. She put the menu down. A man died on my table last month. 41 years old. I've been through the sequence 100 times, and I still find the 2 seconds I would have changed. She kept her voice even. This was not the place for anything else. But I go back. Because the next patient can't wait for me to finish grieving the last one. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't fully name. Somewhere between recognition and something more careful. It's not so different, he said quietly. No, I don't think it is. The food came. They ate. They talked about things that sounded ordinary from the outside the neighborhood around the restaurant. A construction project on the west side. Whether a particular Brooklyn Bridge renovation would ever actually finish. It had the texture of two people who'd been eating lunch together long enough to have run out of urgent things to say. That, Mara knew, was exactly what it needed to look like. She was careful not to let it feel too real. She almost succeeded. Call came at 2 p.m., while they were still in the car back to Westchester. Dante's phone lit up with a name she couldn't read from her angle, and he answered it and listened without speaking. For almost 30 seconds, which was long enough that she noticed the change in his body, the way his hand tightened on the phone, the small adjustment in his jaw. When, he said. A pause. Don't move anything. I'll be there in an hour. He ended the call and looked out the window. What happened? She said. One of our storage facilities in Jersey. Someone accessed it with a legitimate override code. His voice was flat. The only people with that code are my senior staff. The insider. Yes. What was in the facility? He was quiet long enough that she understood he was deciding how much to tell her. Then documentation, financial routing. If Devereaux has it, he stopped, started again. It accelerates his timeline considerably, meaning he doesn't need to wait anymore, meaning he doesn't need me to make a move. He finally looked at her. His eyes were not angry, they were something more controlled than anger, which was, she was beginning to understand, more dangerous. I'm dropping you back at the estate. Victor will be there. Victor doesn't trust me. Victor doesn't trust anyone right now. He held her gaze. Neither should you, she said. The insider sent me the photograph. Stilled. The night you told me about Devereaux. You said either someone on Devereaux's side had a reason to warn me, or someone on your side sent it. She watched him absorb this. Why would the insider warn me? They wouldn't, he said slowly. Unless warning me was a way of warning you. Of proving they had access to the photograph before you did. She kept her voice low. The driver was separated by a partition, but she'd learned that sound traveled in unexpected directions. Whoever sent me that photograph wanted you to know they were already inside your network before you knew what was in it. It wasn't a warning for me. It was a display of capability. Dante was looking at her the way she'd looked at a lab result that had just rearranged everything she'd thought she understood about a patient's prognosis. That's a very sophisticated read, he said. Tell me I'm wrong. Turned back to the window. I'll be back tonight, he said. Victor was on the phone when she got back to the estate, pacing the width of the main room in a tight circuit. He held up a hand when she walked in, not rudely. Just wait. She waited. She sat in a chair near the door and folded her hands in her lap and watched him. He was talking to someone he was angry at, but managing it. Short sentences. Yes. No, I understand. Nothing that revealed content. When he ended the call, his hands were tight at his sides, and he stood for a moment with his back to her before he turned. The Jersey situation, she said. He told you. Some of it. Victor crossed the room and dropped into the chair across from her. He rubbed the bridge of his nose with 2 fingers. He had the look of a man who'd been running at a sustained level of tension, long enough that the tension had stopped feeling like tension, and started feeling like just the baseline. "How long have you worked for him?" she said. 7 years. "And you've never seen anything like this." Victor looked at her with a kind of exhausted sharpness. "What did he tell you about me?" "Your title and the length of the argument this morning." He made a sound, not quite a laugh. "I argued against bringing you here." "I know. I'm not trying to make your life difficult. I'm trying to do my job, and my job right now is—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "There's someone I've trusted for years who is feeding our operations to a man who will not stop at uncomfortable. This isn't Devereaux stealing money. This is Devereaux building a case to dismantle everything. Every structure, every relationship, every safeguard that keeps this organization from collapse." And Dante walks in with a civilian he met in a hotel corridor because of a photograph. Because of a photograph that someone on the inside arranged to be taken. Victor went very still. "The man who photographed us worked for Devereaux. You know that. But someone had to know Dante would be in that corridor. Someone had to know the timing." She held his gaze. "Corridor wasn't accidental. Someone on your team made sure Dante was there at that specific moment. Which means the photograph wasn't a lucky shot. It was commissioned." Victor's face had gone through several things in the past 15 seconds. It had landed somewhere that looked very much like a man standing at the edge of something he hadn't wanted to see. "If that's true," he said slowly, "it means the insider has been planning this longer than 8 months, she said. "And the photograph of me wasn't an accident. It was an invitation for Devereaux to test whether Dante would protect me." She kept her voice steady, which means whoever took it knew Dante would react exactly the way he did. They know him well enough to predict how he responds to an innocent person being put at risk. The room was quiet. Victor's phone rang. He looked at the screen and answered it before the second ring. "What?" A pause. His face went gray. "Don't touch him. Call the paramedics and don't touch him. I'm on my way." He was on his feet before he ended the call. He looked at Mara with an expression that was no longer strategic, it was just shock, wearing the thin surface of a man trying to stay operational. "Who?" she said. "Marco Reyes, my assistant." Victor was already moving. He was at the Jersey facility tonight for the access report. Someone found him at the bottom of the east stairwell. Mara was on her feet before she'd decided to stand. "Is he alive?" "Barely." "Then I'm coming," she said. Victor turned. "You're a trauma nurse?" "Yes." She was already moving past him toward the door. "What's his condition?" Victor grabbed his keys. "They said he wasn't conscious." "Then we're wasting time," she said, and they went. The Jersey facility was a converted warehouse off a service road that didn't appear on most maps, and by the time Victor's car pulled up to the loading dock, the ambulance was already there, with its lights cutting red and white across the wet asphalt in a rhythm that Mara's body recognized before her brain caught up. She was out of the car before Victor finished parking. Marco Reyes was 28 years old, which she registered in the first 3 seconds of seeing him: young, lean, crumpled at the base of the east stairwell where someone had left him, like something they'd set down and forgotten. He was unconscious, but breathing, the breath shallow and irregular in the way that meant the body was working harder than it looked. 2 paramedics were already crouched over him. Mara went in beside them without asking permission, her hands moving to his neck, his wrist, his jaw. "What's his pressure?" she said. The younger paramedic looked up, startled. "Ma'am, trauma nurse, Mercy General. What's his pressure?" 90/60 and dropping. "Possible internal head trauma? Occipital impact. Probable. No visible bleeding, but his pupils are unequal." She checked his pupils herself. The left one was sluggish. Her jaw tightened. "He needs a CT now. Not the nearest urgent care, a level 1 trauma center." "Does your unit have a bypass protocol for—" "We're already on it." The older paramedic, a woman in her 40s with the clipped efficiency of someone who didn't need to be told twice, was already radioing dispatch. "St. Michael's has a trauma bay open." Mara stayed beside Marco until they got the stretcher under him. She helped with the transfer, the particular language of moving a body without disturbing what was already wrong. And she kept her hands busy because keeping her hands busy was the only thing that stopped her from thinking too hard about how. Someone had gotten into a secured facility with a legitimate override code and then left a 28-year-old kid at the bottom of a stairwell. Victor stood behind her the entire time. She could feel him, his stillness, the quality of it, the way a man goes still when he's working very hard not to show that something has reached him. She stepped back when they loaded Marco into the ambulance. She wiped her hands on her jacket. The ambulance pulled away, and the red and white lights went with it, leaving the loading dock in the amber wash of the facility's exterior lights and the particular quiet of wet asphalt cooling. Victor said he was my hire, my responsibility. She turned. His face was doing what faces did when emotion was being managed badly, too still in the wrong places, too tight around the eyes. He's alive, she said. That means someone wanted him alive. Victor looked at her. They could have killed him. They didn't. He's a message. She kept her voice clinical because clinical was the only thing that helped anyone right now. Which means the insider isn't ready to escalate to lethal action yet. They're still in the warning phase. That's very cold comfort. Yes, but it's something. She pulled out her phone. Call Dante. I already texted him. Call him. She held Victor's gaze. He needs to hear your voice. Victor hesitated. Then he pulled out his phone and stepped away to make the call. Mara stood at the edge of the loading dock and looked at the door to the east stairwell. The door was still propped open from when the paramedics had come through, and she could see the bottom 3 steps. From here, the specific geography of where a body had been. She thought about what she'd said in the car. The photograph hadn't been lucky. Someone had engineered Dante's presence in that corridor. Someone who knew him well enough to predict his movements, his habits, the particular way he'd respond to an innocent person in danger. 7 years, Victor had said. She looked at Victor's back while he talked on the phone. His shoulders, the set of them, she thought. I hope I'm wrong about what I'm starting to think. Dante arrived at the facility 40 minutes later. He came through the main entrance, not the loading dock, and the first thing Mara noticed was that he'd brought 2 men she hadn't seen at the estate, both larger than his usual security, moving with the particular economy of people for whom violence was a professional consideration. He dismissed them to the perimeter with 2 words of sit and came to where Mara and Victor were standing in the facility's ground floor corridor. He looked at the stairwell door first, then at Mara. How bad? Unequal pupils, dropping pressure, probable occipital fracture. He's in surgery. She kept it clinical. He'll likely survive if there's no secondary bleed. Dante absorbed this. His face did nothing visible, but his breathing shifted. In a way she'd started to recognize a slight deepening, then a controlled return to even. Impression of something he couldn't afford to feel right now. Victor. The override code was logged at 9:47, Victor said. His voice was operational again. Whatever she'd seen on the loading dock was locked back down. Whoever used it had full access. The documentation storage on the 3rd floor was opened. We don't yet know what was copied versus what was viewed. Financial routing files. Gone. The hard copies and the backup drive. Dante was quiet for a moment. The corridor hummed with the facility's ventilation system. How many people had that code? Victor said. 7, including me. Give me the names. Victor gave them. Dante listened without writing anything down. When Victor finished, Dante said, who had access to the code in the past 6 months? Anyone who could have seen it, copied it, photographed it. Victor opened his mouth, closed it. His jaw worked in the way it did when he was running through something he didn't like the shape of. Code was reset 4 months ago. The reset was handled through my office. I issued it personally to each person on the list. Your office, Dante said. Yes, who had access to your office during that period? Victor's face changed. It was small, the alteration of a man who has just looked at a familiar landscape and seen that something in it has shifted. My assistant coordinated the scheduling, Marco. Marco, Dante said. Marco had the reset calendar. He didn't have the codes themselves. They went directly. Victor stopped. He was very still. They went directly to each recipient via sealed physical envelope. Marco organized the delivery schedule. Dante looked at Victor with the quality of attention that Mara now understood was not coldness but precision, the surgical removal of every variable except the one that mattered. Who picked up and delivered the envelopes? Marco coordinated the Victor's voice stopped working for a second. He restarted it. Marco used a courier service for the outer envelopes, but the inner sealed envelopes, his jaw. Marco handled the inner envelopes. Because I trusted him. because he'd been with me for 3 years, and I trusted him. The silence in the corridor was not comfortable. He's in surgery, Mara said carefully. If he was the access point, the timing of his injury gets more complicated, because the person who left him at the bottom of that stairwell either didn't know he was the source, or the source is not Marco, Dante said. And Marco found something he shouldn't have, and someone shut him up. The ventilation hummed. Somewhere in the facility a door closed, distant. Mara thought about Marco Reyes's face at the bottom of the stairwell, young, collapsed, with the no defensive wounds on his hands that she'd been able to see in those minutes of assessment. No defensive wounds, which meant he hadn't seen it coming, which meant he'd been with someone he trusted. She looked at Victor. He was already thinking it. She could see it in the way his eyes had gone to a fixed point on the wall, the particular unfocus of a man running through the names of people he trusted, and trying to find the one he shouldn't. I need the visitor log for this facility, Dante said. Every entry in the past 30 days. I can pull it tonight, Victor said. Pull it now. Dante held Victor's gaze for a beat longer than was purely instructional. Then he turned to Mara. You didn't have to come. Marco needed medical assessment before the paramedics could make a call on transport. They would have lost 4 minutes. She kept her voice even. 4 minutes is the difference sometimes. He looked at her. Thank you, she almost said. Don't thank me. It's just the job. But it wasn't. She was standing in a warehouse in New Jersey at 11 p.m. because someone had built a trap using her face and a hotel corridor, and somewhere in the same building that surrounded them was the shape of a conspiracy, she was increasingly certain. None of them had fully mapped yet. The visitor log, she said. When you pull it, I want to see it, too. Dante said. Why? Because I'm not a part of your organization. I don't have existing loyalties or blind spots. Give me the log and I'll look at it the way a stranger would, and sometimes that's what you need. A long moment. Then Victor. Send her a copy when it's pulled. Victor, on his phone already, nodded without looking up. They were back at the estate by 1 in the morning. Mara sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and the visitor log that Victor had sent through an encrypted transfer she'd been walked through by one of Don's tech staff, a young man named Sol, who explained everything with the patient brevity of someone who'd learned that most people didn't want the details. They just wanted the thing to work. The log ran to 47 pages of entries across 30 days. She went through it the way she went through patient charts when she was looking for the thing someone had missed, not scanning, not searching for a specific name, just reading it with the assumption that the thing she was looking for would not announce itself. Dante was somewhere in the main wing. She could hear him moving occasionally a door, footsteps, the low register of a phone call through a wall. He hadn't slept and wasn't going to. At 3 a.m. she found it. Not a name, a pattern. Across the 30 days, a series of entries under routine maintenance contracts, HVAC inspection, electrical assessment, elevator certification, all legitimate service companies, all with standard clearance paperwork. But the timing of each visit was oddly consistent. Each fell within 48 hours of a scheduled senior staff meeting, not during the meetings, just before them. And each visit lasted, according to the log, between 22 and 31 minutes, oddly specific for routine maintenance, which tended to run over or under on irregular schedules. She checked the company names against the clearance paperwork attached to each entry, all clean, all licensed, all with verifiable insurance and contractor credentials. Then she searched the HVAC company's name in a standard business registry. The company had been registered 16 months ago. The listed principal was a holding entity out of Delaware. The Delaware entity traced through 2 more layers of registration before it stopped at a corporate address that she recognized not because she'd seen it before, but because it was on the same block in Red Hook that Dante had mentioned on the drive to the restaurant. The block where he had his unnamed building. The one where he went to think. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling and breathed through the implications. Someone had registered a shell company in close geographic proximity to Dante's most private location, close enough that the location could have been chosen deliberately as a signal, a piece of arrogance, or a test, to see if anyone would ever notice. She got up and went to find Dante. He was in the library, standing at the window. He didn't turn when she came in, but he'd heard her. She could tell by the slight shift in his posture, the acknowledgement without performance. The maintenance companies in the visitor log, she said. Shells. All three of them trace back through Delaware holding structures to a registered address in Red Hook. He turned. His face in the low library light was exhausted, in a way the controlled expression didn't quite cover anymore. Red Hook. Half a block from the building you told me about. The one that's not in your name. She watched him. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think someone planted that detail. Someone who knew about the building. Almost no one knows about that building. I know about it, because you told me. She held his gaze. Who else did you tell? The silence in the library was the particular quality of a man being very careful about what he said next, because the wrong thing said quickly would be impossible to take back. Victor knows, Dante said finally, and two others on the senior staff. Victor knew because 2 years ago I brought him there when we needed a space that wasn't monitored. Conversation I couldn't have anywhere else. His voice was controlled, but she could hear the thing under the control. Victor has been with me for 7 years. He rebuilt the logistics network He stopped. After what? After the previous logistics director was arrested on federal racketeering charges 4 years ago. Victor came in and stabilized the entire structure. He's the reason the organization is as intact as it is. His jaw tightened. He's the reason I still have anything operational. Mara looked at him. She thought about the shape of what she was going to say before she said it. The way she thought about how to tell a family that the news was not what they'd hoped. Code reset 4 months ago. Victor issued it personally. The delivery envelopes, he said Marco handled them, but the inner envelopes went directly to each recipient. She paused, or were supposed to. Dante's eyes went to a fixed point over her shoulder. Victor's argument against bringing me here, she said quietly. The way he pushed back this morning. A man trying to protect the organization from an unnecessary variable, or a man trying to prevent someone unpredictable from looking at the visitor logs. Don't. His voice came out harder than he intended. She could tell because he controlled it immediately. Don't build a case on coincidence and proximity. I'm not building a case. I'm showing you a pattern and telling you what it looks like to someone with no history in this room. She kept her voice level. You're the one who decides what it means. He turned back to the window. The grounds outside were dark, the perimeter security moving at the edge of visibility. His reflection in the glass was sharp-edged and tired, in a way she didn't think he let many people see. If it's Victor, he said very quietly, 7 years. Every decision I made through a logistics network he controlled. Every piece of operational security I believed was sound. He stopped. Everything. I know. If it's Victor, then Devero hasn't been building against me for 8 months. He turned from the window. His face was doing something she hadn't seen it do before. Not the controlled precision, not the compressed anger. Something more fundamental. He's been inside for years. Victor gave him everything. She didn't say anything. Sometimes the most useful thing was silence. Dante crossed the library and stopped at the desk and put both hands on its surface and looked at the grain of the wood like it was a problem he could solve by looking at it hard enough. Marco found something, and someone sent him to the bottom of a stairwell to make sure he didn't say it out loud. Victor was already at the facility when Marco was found. He looked up. He got there before me. The fact had been in the sequence of events all along, and she could see him arriving at it, the way she arrived at a diagnosis, not the first piece, but the piece that made all the other pieces settle into shape. I need to verify, he said. His voice had gone very flat. I need to be certain before I move on any of this. Because if I'm wrong, you destroy a 7-year relationship and a man who may have been loyal. Yes. And if you're right? He straightened. He looked at her with eyes that were doing the accounting she'd heard him, describe the careful, brutal ledger of a man who didn't have the luxury of regret. Then the trap we set for Devero was compromised from the moment we set it. Devero knew about you before the photograph. He knew I'd bring you here. He knew the shape of the operation I was building. He was very still, which means everything I've done in the past 48 hours has been exactly what someone else needed me to do. Mara's chest went cold. The lunch, she said. The visibility. The estate. Devero let me believe I was setting the trap. Dante's voice was quiet in a way that was worse than anger. I've been walking into his. The library was silent. Outside, The perimeter security continued its measured circuit. Two men who believed the threat was at the boundary. Neither of them was looking at what was already inside. Dante's phone lit up on the desk between them. The screen showed Victor's name. They both looked at it. It rang twice, 3 times. The name glowed and pulsed with the calm, mechanical patience of a device that had no idea what it was carrying. Dante picked it up on the 4th ring. He answered it and said nothing, just held it to his ear and waited. And across the room, Mara watched his face, and what she saw there was a man looking at 7 years of his life from the outside. For the first time, trying to find the shape of what was real and what had been constructed around him, like a room he'd never known he was locked in. Victor's voice came through the phone, distant and tinny. She couldn't hear the words, but she could see, in the precise moment Dante's hand tightened on the phone, that whatever Victor was saying had just made everything worse. Victor's voice through the phone was steady in the specific way of a man who had rehearsed what he was about to say. "There's been a development," Victor said. "Devero's people reached out through a back channel. They want a meeting. Tonight. Red Hook." Dante said. "Where in Red Hook?" "The warehouse on Coffee Street. The one we used for the Merino settlement 3 years ago." A pause. "They're saying it's Devero himself. In person." "Devero doesn't meet in person." "He does tonight, apparently." Another pause, and in the pause Mara could hear Victor breathing slightly elevated, the rhythm of a man who was performing calm rather than feeling it. "They said to come with 2 people maximum. They said a beat. They said bring the woman." Dante's eyes came up to Mara's face. She held his gaze and didn't move. "I'll call you back," Dante said. He ended the call and set the phone on the desk and looked at it for a moment, like it was a thing that had just changed shape. He said, "Bring the woman," Mara said. "Yes. Devero wants to see me in person." She crossed her arms. Her chest was doing something complicated, but her voice came out level, which tells us something. It tells us the trap is closing. Tells us he doesn't fully believe the photograph yet. She thought through it quickly, the way she triaged in the ERSS. Prioritize. Move. If he believed I was genuinely important to you, he'd use me at a distance. Leverage doesn't need to be in the room. But if he's not sure if he wants to look at me himself and decide, then we still have a window. Dante was looking at her with the expression she'd started to think of as his assessment. Face the one where the calculation was visible not in his eyes, but in the slight tension of his jaw, the controlled stillness of his hands. You understand what going to that warehouse means. It means I'm in the room with a man who views people as operational variables. It means if anything goes wrong, then I'm in a warehouse in Red Hook with no good options. She met his eyes. I've worked Saturday night traumas in an understaffed ER with no attending and a waiting room full of people in active crisis. I understand rooms with no good options. That's not the same. No. But the skill set overlaps more than you'd think. She uncrossed her arms. What's your read on Victor? Right now. Gut. He was quiet for 3 full seconds. I don't know. That's not your gut. That's your head protecting you from your gut. His jaw tightened. My gut says he's the one who's been feeding Devero. He said it the way you said something that cost you flat. Quick. Without decoration. My gut has been saying it since you showed me the visitor log. I've been arguing with it, and now Devero has asked for a meeting and told Victor to bring the woman. Yes. If Victor is the insider, this is the closing move. Devero has the financial documentation. He has the routing files. He has everything he needs to dismantle your operation through the courts or through direct pressure on your remaining allies. What he doesn't have is a clear line to me, Dante said. He can damage the structure. He can't touch me directly without something more, without a face-to-face that he controls. He picked up the phone, set it back down. He needs me in a room he owns, and Victor delivers you there. The library hummed. Outside, the perimeter security continued moving, patient and unknowing. I'm going, Dante said. I need you to understand that's not negotiable. I know, and I'm not taking you. Devero asked for me specifically, which is exactly why you're staying here. She looked at him. If I'm not there, he knows the setup isn't real. He's already uncertain about the photograph showing up without me. Confirms I'm not what he thinks I am. It removes your leverage. You walk into that warehouse with nothing but 2 bodyguards and an organization that's been compromised from the inside for years. She kept her voice even, factual, stripped of anything that would let him dismiss it as emotion. I'm the only variable he doesn't fully understand yet. That's the only edge you have. Dante was very still. I'm not asking you to protect me, she said. I'm telling you that leaving me here makes the math worse. He looked at her for a long time. The particular quality of that look she'd remember it later. In quieter moments, the way it had felt like being seen in full rather than assessed in part. Then he turned away and picked up the phone and called someone whose name she didn't know and spoke for 90 seconds in a low, rapid voice, issuing instructions she could only partially follow: positions, access points, timing. When he ended the call, he didn't look at her. Stay behind me when we enter, he said. Don't speak unless Devero addresses you directly. If I tell you to move, you move. No hesitation. Understood. And Mara, he turned. I need you to trust that I will not let anything happen to you in that room. Not as strategy, not as operational necessity. His voice was quiet and absolutely certain. As a fact, she held his gaze. She thought about a parking garage 12 years ago and a man sitting in it for 4 hours, unable to find anywhere else to take his grief. She thought about what it cost someone to say that sentence. I know, she said. The warehouse on Coffee Street was a 20-minute drive from the estate, and it felt like a different city. Red Hook, at 2 in the morning, was all closed loading docks and pooled streetlight, and the smell of the water coming off the harbor, 2 blocks over salt and diesel, and the particular cold that came off the Kilvan coal when the wind moved right. Dante's driver took a route that Mara understood was not the most direct, doubling back twice, taking streets that allowed a view of what was following. She watched the mirror on her side and saw nothing that looked like pursuit. Victor was already outside the warehouse when they arrived. He was standing beside his own car, hands in his coat, his breath visible in the cold. He watched Dante's SUV pull up, with an expression that was impossible to read in the amber streetlight. Dante got out first, then Mara. 2 of his men, not the estate security, the ones he'd called on the drive, who had the different quality of men brought in for situations that had moved past ordinary, positioned themselves, then belt being then told. 1 at the vehicle, 1 at the warehouse door. Victor looked at Mara. I said this was a mistake. You did, she said. He looked at Dante. Something passed between them that she could feel but not translate the entire weight of 7 years, compressed into a look that lasted 2 seconds and communicated nothing clean. Is he inside? Dante said. His people are. He's supposed to arrive in. Victor checked his phone. 10 minutes. Supposed to. That's what they said. Dante looked at the warehouse door, then at Victor. Walk me through the layout. Victor walked them through it. Main floor, 40 feet wide, subdivided by old shelving infrastructure that created natural channels through the space. A mezzanine level accessible by stairs on the west wall. 2 loading exits at the far end, both currently locked from inside, according to the advance check. Victor said he'd done an hour ago. Dante listened. He asked 3 questions about the mezzanine and the sightlines from the west stairs. Victor answered. The answers were specific and correct. Mara could tell by the way Dante's face processed them. The small confirmations and adjustments, which told her nothing definitive. A man who'd been inside a conspiracy for years would know that the most dangerous moment was the one where his performance had to be perfect. They went inside. The warehouse interior was colder than the street and smelled of old cardboard and something industrial she couldn't name. The overhead lights were on, not all of them, and not bright, but enough to see by. 3 men stood in the central channel between the shelving units. They were dressed without distinction, which was its own kind of distinction. The one in the middle until the light changed. The one in the middle was shorter than the other 2, and had the patient, slightly bored expression of someone who was accustomed to having people brought to him. He was not Rafael Devero. Mara knew it the moment she saw him, not because she knew Devero's face, but because the man in the middle did not have the quality of someone for whom this meeting was a risk. He had the quality of a placeholder. Dante knew it, too. She felt the shift in him, a microscopic tightening of his whole frame, the recalibration of someone who has just identified that the situation is not the shape they were told it was. Mr. Vascari, the placeholder said. Mr. Devero sends his regards. He asked me to convey that this is a preliminary conversation. Where is he? Dante said. Nearby. He'll be available once we've established some ground parameters. Ground parameters, Dante said flatly. A gesture of good faith first. The woman. The placeholder looked at Mara with the neutral assessment of someone completing a task. Mr. Devero would like to speak with her privately. Briefly, Dante said, "No, Mr. Viscari. She's not a token. If Devero wants to meet, he comes here and he meets. There's no private conversation." His voice was completely level. "Those are my ground parameters." The placeholder looked at one of the men beside him. A small nod passed between them. Then the lights went out. Not a flicker. A clean cut, all of them, simultaneously, dropping the warehouse into a dark that was absolute except for the thin seam of streetlight under the loading doors at the far end. Mara's body reacted before her mind. Did she drop her center of gravity and moved left, away from where she'd been standing? Because standing still in sudden darkness was the fastest way to become a stationary target. She heard movement. Fast. Multiple sources. The shelving units. Someone had been in the shelving units. A hand caught her arm, not rough, specific, and she knew by the grip it was Dante. He pulled her behind him, and she let him, because this was not a moment for the principala, and this was Gani Pramsipal of it, and she put her hand on his back so she could feel his movement and track the room through him. A voice in the darkness, Victor's voice, from a position that was wrong. He'd moved during the light cut. He was now closer to the warehouse exit than to Dante, which was not where he'd been standing before. Dante. Victor's voice was strange, compressed. The voice of a man saying something he'd prepared. "I need you to hear me, Victor." Dante's voice in the dark was almost gentle. "Don't. I never wanted it to go this far." The compression in Victor's voice was resolving into something else. Not exactly guilt, not exactly justification, but the specific quality of a man who'd been carrying something for long enough that he needed to put it down. 4 years ago, when they arrested Carmine, Devero came to me. He said the organization was going to collapse, regardless. He said the choice was managed transition or chaos. A pause. He said managed transition meant some people survived. Chaos meant nobody did. Dante was very still. Mara could feel it through her hand on his back. "I kept you alive," Victor said. "Every decision I made, every piece of information I gave him, I controlled what he got and what he didn't get. I kept the parts of this that mattered protected. I kept you protected." His voice broke slightly on the last word, then reassembled. 7 years, Dante. I kept you from the worst of it. "You gave him the financial routing," Dante said. "He already had most of it. Shaped what he saw. You put Marco at the bottom of a stairwell." A long silence. "That wasn't me," Victor said. "I need you to believe that. Devero moved on Marco without telling me." That was his voice cracked. "That was when I knew it had gone somewhere I didn't intend." "You still made the call," Dante said. "Tonight. You called me and told me to come here." No answer. "Victor. He has leverage I can't counter." Victor's voice was barely above a murmur now. "He has documentation on actions I took 4 years ago during the Carmine collapse. Things I did that?" He stopped. "I had no exit. Tonight was supposed to be a conversation. A negotiation. He told me he just wanted to talk to you." "And the lights?" Silence. Dante moved. He moved fast enough that Mara barely tracked it left, using the shelving as cover, pulling her with him in the dark. She heard the men from the shelving units converging on where they'd been standing, the scrape of boots on concrete, and the small sounds of collision as they hit each other in the dark. Dante's phone flashlight came on for 2 seconds, long enough to orient to see the west stairwell 6 feet ahead. Then off. They moved. Her hand stayed on his back, and she kept her feet quiet, hospital-trained quiet, the kind of movement you learned when patients were sleeping, and the floor was littered with equipment. The mezzanine stairs were metal and old, and rang under their feet despite everything. She heard shouting from the warehouse floor, not organized, reactive. They hadn't expected Dante to move that fast. At the top of the mezzanine, a view of the whole floor below. In the thin light from the loading door seam, she could see the 3 men from the placeholder team moving through the shelving channels. She could see Victor standing where he'd been, not moving, his hands open, at his sides like a man who'd passed the point where any action felt available to him. And at the far end of the warehouse, the loading doors were opening, not from the inside, from the outside. In the widening seam of streetlight, Flanked by two men she didn't recognize, stood a figure in a dark coat. He walked with the unhurried pace of someone who had arranged every element of the room before he entered it. Rafael Davero. He looked up at the mezzanine. He could see them, she could tell by the angle of his face, freight. The slight pause before he continued walking. He'd expected them to be on the floor, cornered. Instead, they were above him, with a complete view of his deployment. Something in his expression adjusted the way a chess player's expression adjusts when their opponent makes an unexpected move. He stopped in the center of the floor. "Mr. Vescari," he said. His voice carried easily in the warehouse's open acoustics. Calm, almost conversational. "I've been looking forward to this." Dante didn't answer immediately. He was scanning the mezzanine level, left-right, the far walkway. Mara scanned it with him. No one up here. They'd come up ahead of Davero's plan. "You took my files," Dante said. "You took a woman," Davero said pleasantly. "We've both been acquiring things. Let her go, and we talk. Man to man." Davero smiled. She could see the shape of it even from the mezzanine. "She goes nowhere. She's the most interesting thing in this room." He looked up at Mara directly, and the quality of that look clinical, calculating, with no particular malice, but no warmth either. The look of a man who saw people as components made her stomach harden. "Tell me, Ms. Vey, how much has he told you about what he actually is?" She said nothing. "The women Dante Vescari protects tend to be women he's decided serve a function," Davero continued. "I'm curious what function you're serving." "Don't answer him," Dante said quietly. "I'm not going to," she said. Davero looked back up at Dante. "Here's the simple version. I have your financial infrastructure in documents I've already distributed to holding locations. I have enough to bring federal scrutiny down on every legitimate business you've built in the last 5 years. I have Victor's testimony, which he'll give, because the alternative for Victor is considerably less comfortable. He let that settle. What I want is a structured exit. You step back from your operations. You transition your networks to my management. You keep your personal assets and your freedom." A pause. "And the woman goes home," Dante said. "And if I don't, then the documents go to 3 different federal contacts I've been cultivating for 2 years. And you spend the next decade in litigation that will cost you everything anyway, but with considerably more suffering attached." The warehouse was very quiet. On the floor below, the 3 men from Davero's team had repositioned, one near the west stairwell, one at the east, one behind Davero in the channel. Clean geometry. No visible weapons, but the geometry itself was the communication. Mara looked at the man near the west stairwell. He was the largest of the 3, and he'd placed himself at the base of the stairs they'd come up on. He was watching the mezzanine level, but not the mezzanine edge. He was watching the stairwell entrance, waiting for downward movement, not the walkway. She leaned close to Dante and said, barely above a breath, "There's an access panel in the east wall. I saw it when Victor described the layout. Old building mezzanine levels in these warehouses from this era had emergency egress to the roof." He turned his head a fraction toward her. "If we can get Davero's people looking at the west stairwell," she said. "The east walkway buys us 60 seconds. To do what? To get Davero alone." She held his gaze in the thin light. Without his geometry, Dante looked at the floor below, then at her. "How confident are you about the access panel?" 60%. "That's not high. It's what I have." He was quiet for 2 seconds. Then he straightened up, and his voice, when he spoke, carried down to the warehouse floor with a completely different quality, not the compressed control, not the careful precision. Something raw, something that sounded like a man who'd calculated and decided and was done with patience. "Victor," he said. On the floor, Victor looked up. "The East Loading Manifest from the Merino settlement. Where did we store the secondary documentation?" Victor's face cycled through several things fast. "Then West Annex, red binders. Go get them." Victor stared at him. "Victor, go get them." And in the specific way that 7 years of instilled trust operated, even when everything else had broken, even now, even here, with everything between them cracked and raw and past repairing. Victor moved toward the west end of the warehouse. and Davero's man at the west stairwell turned to track him, and Davero himself turned fractionally to watch what Dante was doing. And in the 3 seconds of collective redirected attention, Dante moved and Mara moved with him, east along the mezzanine walkway, fast and low toward a wall. She was 60% certain held the way out. The access panel was there. She hit it with her shoulder before she'd fully reached it, and it gave with the particular giving of something old and metal that hadn't been used in a long time, and the cold night air from the roof hit her face. And behind her she heard the shouting start, Davero's voice, sharp and cracked open. For the first time, the sound of a man whose careful room had just rearranged itself around him. Dante was through the panel behind her. He pulled it shut. Above them, the roof of the warehouse stretched flat and black under an overcast sky, the harbor lights of Red Hook visible to the south, and somewhere below them the geometry of Davero's careful plan was coming apart at the places he hadn't accounted for. Dante's phone was already in his hand. He made a call that lasted 4 words east roof. Now move. He ended it and looked at her. He was breathing hard the first time she'd seen his breath break the controlled surface, the first time his body had admitted to the full weight of what the last hour had cost it. There was something on his jaw that might have been a cut from the shelving unit in the dark, and his suit was done, and he looked more like the man she'd talked to in the library at 3 in the morning than the man who'd walked into any of this with a controlled expression and a plan. 60%, he said. It worked. 60% worked. Medicine is mostly 60% in good reflexes, she said. He looked at her for a long moment in the cold roof air. Below them she could hear movement Davero's people trying to find the exit path, trying to reassemble the geometry. Above them the overcast sky showed no stars. The harbor smell was stronger up here. Davero still has the documents, she said. Yes, this isn't over. No. He looked south toward the water, but he came to the warehouse himself, which means there's something he needed to see that he couldn't get from documentation alone. He turned to her. He came because he still doesn't understand what you are to me. He needed to see it in person to decide how to use it. And did he decide? I don't know. Dante looked at her with an expression that had somewhere in the past hour of darkness and running and 60% chances lost most of its architecture. What was left underneath was something less managed, something tired and certain and not entirely controlled. But I have. Below them, doors were opening. The sound of Dante's men arriving at the east perimeter 4 vehicles, the rumble of engines, the sharp exchanges of radio communication, and somewhere inside the house, the controlled sound of Rafael Davero realizing that the room he'd arranged so carefully had one wall he hadn't seen coming, and that wall had held. Dante moved toward the roof's edge, where a fire escape ladder gave access to the east alley. He went first, then reached back for her hand, and she took it, and they went down into the alley where his people were waiting. In the noise and the cold and the incomplete victory of a man who had come to a warehouse to be cornered, and stop on the one angle Davero had failed to calculate. The documents were still out there. Davero was still standing in the wreckage of a plan that had not fully collapsed. Victor was still somewhere in the warehouse, carrying 7 years of damage in both directions. And the night was not finished with any of them yet, not by a distance that anyone standing in that alley, breathing cold harbor air, could honestly call comfortable. They stood in the east alley for 4 minutes, while Dante's people locked down the perimeter, and those 4 minutes were the longest Mara had spent standing still since the corridor at the Westfield Grand. Cold came off the harbor in waves. She could feel it through her jacket, through the thin layer of adrenaline still burning in her chest, and she focused on it deliberately, the specific temperature of the air, the grit of the alley surface under her shoes, the sound of radios and low voices, and the distant movement of water, because focusing on physical reality was the only reliable way she knew to bring herself back from the edge of something her body wanted to call panic, but that she refused to name. Dante was on his phone. He'd been on it since the bottom of the fire escape ladder, moving through 3 separate calls with the speed of someone who had contingency plans for his contingency plans. And even now, even with the cut on his jaw and his suit ruined, and his 7-year relationship with Victor Hale reduced to rubble, in a dark warehouse full the operational machinery in him had not stopped. She understood it differently now than she would have 2 weeks ago, not as coldness, but as the thing that kept people alive when the room was still moving. He ended the 3rd call and came to stand beside her. "Devero is still inside," he said. "My people have the exits covered. He's not going anywhere." "What does that buy you?" "Time." He looked at the warehouse wall. "The documents he threatened me with, the financial routing files, the distribution records, he's had them for less than 12 hours. He hasn't moved them yet. You know that." "I know where they are." He said it simply. Stared at him. The Jersey facility was a decoy. The real routing documentation was moved 6 weeks ago to a location only I have access to. What Victor gave Davero was a partial set accurate enough to look complete, incomplete enough to be useless in a federal proceeding. She absorbed this. "You suspected Victor 6 weeks ago." "I suspected someone. I didn't know who." He looked at her. "I restructured the documentation in a way that would tell me what the leak was actually reaching. The specific files Devero took would only be complete if combined with a secondary set. Without it, what he has is noise, and the secondary set is in a location Victor never knew about." His jaw tightened. "I spent 3 weeks setting it up. I told Victor I was restructuring the financial architecture for tax purposes. He believed me because it was the kind of thing I actually do." She looked at him for a moment. "You've been running a separate operation inside your own organization." "Yes." "While also running the operation everyone else could see." "Yes," she almost said. "That's exhausting." Instead, she said, "So the meeting tonight, Devero coming here in person, came because he needed to confirm the documents were usable. He needed me to react as if they were complete. If I'd folded tonight, if I'd agreed to his terms, that would have told him the partial set was enough to use as leverage." His voice was level, but underneath it, something had worn thin, not the control exactly, but the effort of maintaining it. "Instead, I ran, which told him the documents might be incomplete, which told him he has a problem." He looked at the warehouse. "He's in there right now trying to figure out what he's missing." She thought about Devero in the warehouse, the unhurried patience of a man who'd arranged every piece, and then the moment on the roof when his voice had cracked, just slightly, in the realization that the room had a wall he hadn't seen. "He'll try to get to you before he shows his hand to anyone else. He needs to know what he's holding before he can threaten you with it, which means he'll want to talk. On my terms this time." Dante looked at her. "There's one more thing I need to do tonight. Victor." "Victor." She waited. "I need you to stay out here," he said. "No." He looked at her. "You're about to walk back into a warehouse where a man who's been betraying you for an indeterminate number of years is standing in the dark with nothing left to lose," she said. "You need someone at your back who Davero hasn't bought. My people have been inside Victor's organizational structure for years. You don't know who else he's compromised." She held his gaze. "I'm the only person in this alley who came in from completely outside. You told me that 2 days ago Devero doesn't know what I am. That's still true. Use it." He looked at her for a long moment. Cut on his jaw had dried into a dark line. His eyes were exhausted and precise. And something else she'd been watching develop across 2 weeks, without letting herself name it. "Stay behind me," he said. "Same as before." "Same as before," she agreed. Victor was sitting on a crate at the center of the warehouse floor when they came back through the loading door. Davro's 3 men were along the west wall, no longer in deployment geometry, just standing, the particular stillness of people who've been told to wait without being told what comes next. Davero himself stood near the shelving units, his coat still immaculate, his expression rearranged into something neutral and watchful. The lights were back on. Someone had found the breaker. Victor looked up when Dante walked in. His face had the quality of a landscape after a storm. Everything had moved, and the new positions of things were not necessarily where they'd fallen, but where they'd finally settled after the sliding stopped. He looked older than he had at breakfast that morning. He looked like a man who had put something down that had been very heavy for a very long time, and was now discovering that carrying it had structured him in ways that made the putting down its own kind of damage. Dante stopped 5 feet from him. The warehouse was quiet, except for the ventilation system and the distant sound of the harbor. "How long?" Dante said. Not a question exactly, more like a sentence that needed its other half. Victor looked at his hands. The first contact was 4 years ago. During the Carmine collapse, he paused. The first piece of information I gave Davero was the projected timeline of Carmine's federal plea negotiation. I told myself it would accelerate a transition that was happening anyway. Fewer people would get hurt. He stopped. I kept telling myself versions of that for 4 years. And Marco. I didn't touch Marco. Victor's head came up. His eyes were red-edged and direct. I need you to hold on to that. Whatever else I am, I did not touch Marco. I found out Davero had moved on him when I arrived at the facility. His voice fractured slightly. He's 28 years old. He covered for me 3 months ago, when I was late, returning from a meeting I shouldn't have been at. He brought me coffee and didn't ask questions. I would not. He stopped, restarted. I would not. Dante looked at him. The silence between them lasted long enough that Mara counted her own heartbeats and got to 11. "The meetings," Dante said. "The maintenance company shell registrations. The access code distribution. All me." Victor's voice was flat, confessional, in the way of a man who has decided the only remaining dignity is accuracy. The maintenance companies were Davero's structure. I provided access to the facility schedules. The access code, I gave Davero the partial code sequence. Not the full override, but enough that his people could reconstruct it given facility-level access. He looked at Dante. I tried to limit what he could do with what I gave him. I know how that sounds. It sounds like something a man tells himself. Yes. Victor looked back at his hands. It does. Davero moved. Not dramatically, just a shift of weight, a slight clearing of his throat, the polite interruption of a man who'd been waiting for a pause in someone else's conversation. "Touching as this is," he said, "we still have the matter of our earlier discussion." Dante turned to look at him. He didn't move toward him. He just turned and looked, and the quality of that look was different from anything Mara had seen from him before. Not the compressed control, not the precision. Something simpler, the look of a man who has made a decision and is standing behind it fully. "You have incomplete documentation," Dante said. "You've known it since you looked at the routing files tonight. The secondary financial structure isn't in anything Victor gave you, which means the federal case you're threatening me with is a framework without a foundation." He kept his voice conversational, almost pleasant. "What you have is enough to make noise. It's not enough to make a case." Davero's expression did not change, which was, Mara understood, its own kind of confirmation. "Here's what I'm offering," Dante said. "You leave tonight. You leave the documentation, all of it. Every copy, every distribution point you told me about, every location you've staged it, you withdraw it completely. In exchange, I don't turn over what I have on your financial network to the 3 federal contacts I've been cultivating for 22 months. He paused. "Unlike yours, My federal contacts have active case files. The warehouse was very still. You've been building a federal case against me, Davero said. I've been building insurance, Dante said. I don't want to use it. Using it means scrutiny I don't want either. This is why the offer is clean. You walk. I put the insurance in a drawer. We stop costing each other money we could be making. Davero looked at him. He had very dark eyes, and they were doing rapid work behind the still surface of his face. Victor. Victor is my problem. Victor has obligations to me that predate tonight. Victor's obligations to you end tonight, Dante said, because the alternative for Victor is that I hand him to the same federal contacts with a full accounting of what he gave you, which means Victor goes to prison and you lose your primary inside access in one move. He let that sit. Victor stays. His obligations to you are finished. That's part of the offer. Davero was quiet for a long time. He looked at Victor, who was still sitting on the crate and had gone very still in the particular way of a man who is hearing his life being bargained over and has no move left of his own. He looked at Mara, that same clinical assessment, the attempt to determine her function. She met his gaze and held it and gave him nothing. Then he looked back at Dante and said, "The Red Hook building, the one not in your name." Dante said nothing. "That's how I knew where to register the shell company," Davero said. "I wanted you to find it eventually. I wanted you to understand that I was already that close." He paused. "Victor didn't give me that location. I want to be clear about that." His eyes moved briefly to Victor, something in them that was not quite respect but was in that neighborhood. "I found it myself. 18 months of patience." Dante absorbed this. "Why are you telling me that?" "Because you should know what you're actually dealing with." Davero straightened his coat. "And because I'm going to accept your offer. And when two men accept an offer, it is better if they understand each other accurately." He nodded once to his 3 men. They moved toward the loading doors without being given specific instruction, the movement of people who'd been trained to read an exit correctly. Davero followed them, pausing at the door. "The documentation will be withdrawn by tomorrow morning," he said. "Every copy, every distribution point." He looked at Dante one last time. "You built a better trap than I gave you credit for. You built a better operation than I gave you credit for," Dante said. Davero almost smiled. Then he walked through the loading door and was gone, and the warehouse exhaled, and nobody said anything for the better part of 30 seconds. Mara sat with Victor while Dante made calls outside. She didn't plan to. She'd been walking toward the loading door for air and fresh distance from the smell of old cardboard. When she noticed Victor hadn't moved from the crate, and there was something in his posture, not defeat exactly, the specific deflation of a man whose forward motion had been entirely structural and had just had all structure removed, that made her stop. She sat on the crate beside him. He looked at her sidelong. "You don't have to. I know." They were quiet for a moment. "Marco's going to be okay," she said. The injury pattern suggested no secondary bleed. If the CT confirmed that, he's looking at recovery, not permanent damage. Victor's throat moved. "You can tell that from a field assessment?" "Sometimes I've been wrong." She looked at her hands. "I've been right more often. That's all you get." Victor looked at the floor. "I used to think the difference between a man who does this work and a man who doesn't is what they're willing to give up to protect what matters." His voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before, not the operational brevity, not the controlled antagonism from the breakfast table. Something worn down to its actual grain. "I gave up the wrong things, in the wrong order, and I kept telling myself the accounting would balance eventually." "Does it?" she said. "No." He looked at her. "You know it doesn't. You carry the 41-year-old man." She looked at him. He'd remembered that. From the restaurant, from the conversation she'd thought was mostly performance. He'd been listening the way people listened when they recognized something. "The difference," she said, is that I go back. The next day. Because the next patient can't wait. She paused. You still have a next day. Question is what you do with it. Victor was quiet for a long time. Then he's going to have to dismantle a significant portion of what I built. Structures that Devero's people touched are compromised. Years of work. I know. I know that I'm part of why. He said it without drama. Just accounting the same kind Dante kept. I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not sure I want it. What I want is, he stopped. I want to know that Marco gets to be okay. That's what I want. She said, then make sure you're around to see it. He looked at her. She held his gaze. Then he nodded once the same kind of nod Dante used, she thought. The nod of people who had learned that single movements could carry the weight of paragraphs. The drive back to the estate was quiet. Dante sat beside her in the back of the SUV, and he didn't look at his phone, and he didn't make calls. He looked out the window at the red hook streets, giving way to the highway, and she looked out her window, and the city moved past them in the particular way. It moved at 4 in the morning, thin and honest, stripped of the daytime density that made it easy to forget how much of it was just people trying to get from one thing to the next without losing too much on the way. After 20 minutes, he said, 2 weeks. She turned from the window. The agreement was 2 weeks, he said. He was still looking out his window. That ends in 4 days. She didn't say anything. Devero will withdraw. The documentation will be gone. Threat that brought you into this is finished. He turned from the window and looked at her. His face in the passing highway light was tired and unguarded in a way she'd only seen in the library at 3 in the morning. And she understood that this was the face behind all the architecture, not diminished by it, just actual. You can go back to your apartment, your shifts. Hector and his arroz con palo. I know, she said. He held her gaze. I'm not going to ask you to stay. I know that too, because what I am doesn't reduce. I'm going to spend the next year dismantling the parts of this that are too compromised to salvage. I'm going to rebuild the legitimate structures. There will be a period of significant complexity. He said it directly, without softening. That is not a life I would offer someone who didn't choose it with full information. She looked at him. She thought about the service corridor and the split-second grab that had set all of this in motion. She thought about a parking garage and 4 hours of grief and a man who needed to step out of his own performance to remember what he actually thought. She thought about 60% chances and access panels and the way his hand had reached back for her on the fire escape without making it a question. I work trauma, she said. I've spent 11 years making decisions in rooms where the information is incomplete and the stakes are maximum, and there is no version of this where nobody gets hurt. She kept her voice steady. I know what complexity looks like. I'm not afraid of it. This is different. Every patient thinks their case is different. Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, not quite the thing that lived near tears, but something in the territory between them. You're going to compare everything I say to hospital situations, only when the comparison is accurate. She held his gaze. I'm not staying because I don't have anywhere else to go. I have somewhere to go. I like my apartment. I like Hector's cooking. I like my job. She let that sit for a moment. I'm saying I want to choose this, whatever this is, with complete information and no obligation and no performance required. She paused. If you want the same thing. The highway lights moved across his face in slow intervals. Outside, the city was beginning to thin into the suburban dark of Westchester, the landscape opening up the way it did when you'd driven far enough from the density to breathe differently. He said, I've spent a long time in rooms where I know what every person wants from me, where I can see the angle before they state it. He looked at her. I don't know what to do with someone who doesn't have an angle. Get used to it, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached across the seat and put his hand over hers, not romantic, not performative, just specific and certain, the gesture of a man who had decided on something and was putting his hand behind the decision. She turned her hand over and held it. They didn't say anything else. The highway carried them north through the thinning through the dark and the distance, towards the estate and the garden going slightly wild at the edges and the east wing, with its view of the morning coming in over the grounds. The dismantling took 8 months. Dante began it the week after the warehouse, not because he was ready, but because waiting for readiness was the kind of luxury that situations didn't offer. He started with the structures Victor had touched, which meant starting almost everywhere, which meant 8 months of work that looked from the outside like a company in reorganization and felt from the inside like surgery performed on a moving patient. Victor cooperated. That was the twist nobody had seen coming. Least of all Victor himself, the man who'd spent 4 years feeding information to a competitor, turned out to be meticulous, organized, deeply familiar with every compromised element of the structure he'd helped compromise. He mapped it from memory. He sat in rooms with Dante's attorneys and Dante's new logistics team and described the architecture of his own betrayal with the same thoroughness he'd once applied to building it. He didn't ask for absolution. He asked for accuracy, which was different, and he was given it. Marco Reyes spent 3 weeks in recovery and came back to work with a scar at the base of his skull and a mild sensitivity to fluorescent light that he complained about with an equanimity that Mara found genuinely admirable. He didn't know the full shape of what Victor had done. He knew what he needed to know and not more, which was a line Dante had drawn carefully and held. Devero withdrew the documentation. All of it, every copy, every distribution point, the withdrawal, verified through channels that Dante's new federal contact confirmed without being asked to confirm it. Kind of quiet professional courtesy that meant the contact was now an active relationship and not just a contingency. Devero's network continued to operate. He and Dante did not speak again. They existed in the same city as men who have agreed on terms. Exist with the particular care of people who understand that the cost of breaking an agreement is higher than the benefit of making one. Mara went back to Mercy General. She went back because she'd said she would, and because she meant it, and because walking through the doors of the ER on the first morning back and hearing the specific noise of it, the overlapping voices, the equipment sounds, the managed chaos of a place where people arrived broken, and sometimes left whole felt like putting on something that fit. She worked her shifts. She covered for colleagues when she could. She filed her incident reports and attended her case reviews and ate lunch standing over sinks and didn't stop carrying the 41-year-old father of 2 because that was not the kind of weight that got put down. It just got integrated, folded into the tissue of how you moved through the work, so that it made you more careful rather than less present. She and Dante rebuilt something across those 8 months that neither of them had a pre-existing template for, which meant they built it from scratch and got some of it wrong and corrected as they went. He came to her apartment twice a week on the evenings she wasn't working, and he ate the food she cooked without caring about it, and he drank his coffee with a small amount of cream and no sugar, and he talked to her about the work in the specific way he'd discovered she could receive, not shielded, not managed, just actual, and she talked to him about her work in the specific way he received, which was with the focused attention of a man who had spent a long time in rooms full of people performing and had learned to recognize when someone was not. Hector from the 4th floor met Dante twice. The first time he looked at him with profound suspicion and said nothing. The second time, he left a container of a rose con polo outside the door with a note that said only for 2. Mara found it and laughed in a way she hadn't laughed in a long time, unguarded, loud, slightly embarrassed by how loud. In the kitchen of her small apartment, while the evening came in through the window, over the fire escape, the pigeons cranksply, where the pigeons still gathered, unchanged, unaware that anything in the apartment below them had shifted at all. 8 months and 11 days after the warehouse, on Coffee Street, Mara finished a 12-hour shift and came out of the hospital into the first cool evening of October, the air finally breaking from the summer's long grip, carrying the smell of something turning that New York always carried. In October, the city composting its own warmth back into the ground. Dante was outside, no SUV, no driver at the curb. He was standing on the sidewalk in a coat she hadn't seen before, dark gray, and his hands were in his pockets. And he was watching the hospital entrance with the quality of attention she'd first noticed in a service corridor when she'd grabbed his sleeve because she had no better option. He had no guards visible. She looked for them out of habit. They checked the sidewalk, both directions, the parked cars, the people moving past. Nothing that looked like security. Just the ordinary evening crowd of a hospital block, visitors and staff, and the ambient motion of people who had somewhere to be. She walked toward him. He watched her come with that attention that she'd stopped finding unsettling and started finding steadying the attention of someone who was actually looking, not performing looking. When she reached him, she said, "You're early. Shift ran long." It usually does. She looked at him. 8 months of reconstruction in his face, not less tired exactly, but differently tired. The tiredness of someone who had been doing work that meant something rather than work that simply needed to be done. Scar on his jaw had faded to a thin line she'd stopped noticing. "How's the legitimization proceeding?" "Slower than I'd like. Faster than the attorneys predicted." He looked at her in the October evening. The Red Hook building passed its commercial zoning review. "The one that's not in your name." "It is now." He paused. "I'm going to put something real in it. I haven't decided what yet." She looked at him. She thought about the fourth floor he'd described, the view of the water, the nights he'd spent there, trying to remember what he actually thought. "Something that doesn't need to be hidden," she said. "Yes." He held her gaze. "Something worth showing." The evening traffic moved around them. A cab honked a block away. The hospital doors opened and closed behind her, breathing people in and out, the ordinary rhythm of a place that ran on the perpetual motion of people in need and people who'd chosen to meet that need, day after day, in rooms that were never simple. He took his hand out of his pocket and held it out to her. She looked at his hand. She thought about a service corridor and broken crystal on a concrete floor, and the split-second calculation of a woman with diminishing options who'd grabbed the nearest solid thing. She thought about how wrong that calculation could have gone, and how, in the specific way that some wrong things went, it had instead gone somewhere she hadn't known to look for. She took his hand. They stood on the sidewalk for a moment, not moving anywhere yet, just occupying the specific coordinates of a Tuesday evening in October outside a hospital in Manhattan. Two people who had come to each other through a corridor neither of them had chosen, through a photograph and a dark warehouse, and 60% chances, and the particular arithmetic of trust rebuilt on the ruins of its own betrayal. Then they walked. Nowhere urgent. Just the block, and the evening, and the city going about the enormous ordinary business of being itself around them. She had entered that service corridor 8 months ago looking for somewhere to hide. She had found, instead, the only man powerful enough to put himself between her and the worst of it, and human enough, in the end, to let her choose whether she wanted to stay. She had chosen, not because the life was simple, not because the man was easy, but because choosing, fully and with complete information and no performance required, was the only kind of choosing that meant anything at all. The October evening folded around them, and the city moved, and somewhere across the river, the harbor lights came on, one by one, the way they always did at the end of the day, patient, steady, illuminating Nothing dramatic. Just the water and the dark, and the distance between here and the far shore, which was, when you had someone's hand in yours, considerably less than it had seemed before. Mara kept his hand the whole walk. They went 2 blocks south, then west toward the river, not because either of them had decided on a destination, but because the evening was cool enough to be worth moving through, and neither of them was ready to be inside yet. The city did what it did at this hour, thinned at the edges and thickened at the center. Cabs and delivery bikes, and people moving with the particular purposefulness of a Tuesday evening, everyone going somewhere. That was not remarkable, but was theirs. She'd stopped finding the silence between them, uncomfortable somewhere around the 3rd week at the estate. It had happened without announcement one evening. She'd been sitting in the library reading, and he'd been at the desk working, and she'd looked up and realized that the quiet had the quality of something inhabited rather than something endured. She'd looked back at her book without saying anything about it. Some things didn't need to be named to be real. "Victor called me today," she said. Dante looked at her. "About what?" "Marco. Apparently Marco is being promoted into a coordination role. Victor wanted to tell me himself." She paused. "I think he wanted to tell someone who would understand why it mattered to him." Dante was quiet for a moment. "Victor doesn't have many people left who will take his calls." "No." She watched the sidewalk. "He's trying. In the way of someone who doesn't entirely believe they deserve to succeed, but is going to try anyway." She glanced at Dante. "I think that's the most honest version of trying there is." Dante said nothing, but his hand shifted slightly in hers, not pulling away, just repositioning, the way you resettled something you intended to keep holding. They reached the river. The promenade was quiet at this hour. A few joggers, a couple with a dog, the water dark and moving below them, with the indifference of something that had been here longer than anything built on its banks. The lights of the far shore reflected in broken lines across the surface. Dante leaned on the railing and looked at the water. She stood beside him and did the same. "The last of Devero's documentation was confirmed destroyed this morning," he said. "My contact verified it through an independent channel. I know, you texted me. I wanted to say it out loud." He looked at the water. "It's different, saying it out loud." She understood that. There were things in the ER that she wrote in charts, and then needed to say to Philippa over bad coffee, just to make them real in a different register. The body knew the difference between recorded and spoken. "It's over then," she said. "The part that started in that corridor." "That part," he said. "Yes." She looked at him sidelong. The October air moved his coat. The scar on his jaw was a thin, pale line in the light off the water. He looked like a man standing at the end of something, and the beginning of something else, which was, she supposed, exactly what he was. "Say the rest of it," she said. He turned his head toward her. "What rest? You've been carrying something since you picked me up from the hospital. You have the face you get when there's a sentence you haven't finished." He almost smiled. "I have a face for that. You have several faces I've cataloged. That's one of them." She turned to face him fully, her back to the water. "Say it." He looked at her for a moment. The river moved behind her. Somewhere a boat horn sounded, distant and low. "I'm going to be different at the end of this than I was at the beginning," he said. "The restructuring, the legitimate side, the transition, it changes the shape of things, the shape of me in the work." He paused. "I don't know yet exactly what that looks like. I don't know what I am without the parts I'm dismantling." "That's the sentence?" "Part of it. Say the rest." He held her gaze. "I want to know if you're staying for what I was, or for what I'm becoming. 'Cause I can't promise they're the same." She looked at him. She thought about the question the way she thought about complex diagnoses, not rushing toward the answer, letting the full picture assemble before committing to a read. "When a patient comes into my ER," she said, "I don't treat who they were last year. I treat who they are on the table in front of me, with everything their history has made of them, and everything they might still be if I do my job right. She kept her eyes on his. I'm not here for who you were in that corridor. I'm not here for who you were in the warehouse. I'm here for the version of you that's being built out of all of it, including the parts that didn't survive. She paused. That's the only version I've ever actually known. He was very still. So she said, say the last part. A long moment. The water moved. The boat horn again, farther away this time. I want you to move in, he said. Not the estate. Somewhere we choose. Somewhere that's not already weighted with everything the estate is weighted with. He held her gaze steadily. I want a place that belongs to both of us before it belongs to any of what I've been. She had not expected that specific shape. She'd expected something more guarded, more conditional, something that left him an architectural exit. This was not that. This was a man who had spent 8 months learning how to say a thing without building an escape into it. She breathed through the moment. Let it be as large as it actually was. The Red Hook building, she said. He blinked. That's a warehouse. You said you were going to put something real in it. Something worth showing. She held his gaze. The 4th floor has a view of the water. You told me that the first week. Something moved across his face, that she'd seen very few times and treasured each one, the unguarded version, the one that existed for a half second before the architecture reassembled. It needs significant renovation. I'm aware. It would take months. I have a job with irregular hours and a high tolerance for chaos. She looked at him steadily. I think I can manage a renovation. He looked at her for a long moment. The river behind her, the October evening around them, the city making its enormous ordinary noise in every direction, indifferent and constant and alive. All right, he said, quietly, like a decision that had been made somewhere earlier and was only now being confirmed out loud. All right, she said. He straightened from the railing. She turned back toward the water for a moment. One last look at the lights, reflecting in the broken surface. The far shore with its own lights. The dark distance between here and there that was crossable, that had always been crossable, that only required someone willing to make the trip. Then she turned back and they walked. No direction decided out loud. Just the evening and the block and his hand and hers, the city composting its summer warmth into the ground around them. October doing what October did, making room for something new by clearing away what the season had finished with. She had come to a service corridor 8 months ago with diminishing options and grabbed the nearest solid thing. She had been photographed. She had been frightened. She had sat in a borrowed room at 3 in the morning and listened to an estate gum, breathe, and tried to calculate the shape of what she'd stepped into. She had not calculated this. She had not known to. But she was a trauma nurse. She worked in rooms where the information was incomplete and the stakes were maximum, and the only thing you could control was the quality of your attention and the steadiness of your hands. She had learned, across 11 years of those rooms, that the cases you didn't expect were sometimes the ones that reminded you what the work was, actually, for not the clean ones, not the textbook presentations, the ones that came in sideways and made you reconsider every assumption, and then, somehow, against the odds you'd already calculated, held on. She held on. So did he. The October evening received them both. Ordinary and unremarkable. 2 people on a sidewalk, in a city full of people on sidewalks, going somewhere that was theirs. That was enough. That was, it turned out, exactly enough.